Brent here with Bring Your Own Tools. On today's episode, if you want to learn how we built and installed this beautiful solid walnut working station without having to see any of the hardware below, keep on watching. Let's get started.
And yes, we are using black American walnut again because it's just one of my favorite woods. Now this again is S3S, which means it's surfaced 3 sides, perfect sides on 3 sides, but this top one needs to be cut down to make sure we have a perfectly square board. So let's get to it.
Now the one tool I always suggest using when pushing long boards through a table saw is a feather board, that big bright blue thing right there. It basically acts as a third hand because it's pushing pressure against the table saw fence while I'm pushing the board through. Now after I have them all squared up and looking perfect, I then go to my chop saw and just chop off the ends evenly, as well as cutting the boards a little extra long because I'll be actually cutting the exact dimension on site. Now at this point in time, the boards are ready for glue up, so I'm actually taking some pencil marks and lining out where I'm going to be placing my biscuits. I place a mark 6 inches on the ends, as well as a preceding 12-inch increments throughout the remainder of the board. Now a biscuit joiner is basically just a horizontal circular saw. It makes a perfect indentation for our biscuits to travel in, and all we have to do is place it on the center of our pencil mark. It makes it very easy to do, and I'm able to accomplish all of these in a very short amount of time. Now there are plenty of clamps out there, but my personal preference are bar clamps. They're very easy to use, they're very effective, and they're actually somewhat inexpensive. Now as for wood glue, my personal preference is Titebond 2 with a silicone glue brush. Now the silicone brush is very easy to apply glue to the wood, as well as makes for easy cleanup. Cleanup is definitely not my favorite portion of a project, but wood glue does not like silicone, so it peels right off. Now after you have all of your biscuits in place on one side, you can then push the 2 boards together. You might need to give it a little bit of a love tap with a rubber mallet, but that is hopefully something that you don't have to do. After you have them all placed, go ahead and start clamping them down evenly. Now the truly amazing thing about the biscuits is the fact that it really does line up the tops of the boards very evenly throughout the entire span. Now you might have to adjust on the ends, but the middle seems to be extremely flat as long as you cut the biscuit hole placements properly. Now I'd also highly recommend at this point to clean up all of your glue lines if possible, because it's a lot easier to clean up now than later. Now after you have the board fully cleaned up, you might have noticed that there's some knot holes. Yeah, walnut is notorious for some larger knot holes, so let's go ahead and fill them up. I place some duct tape at the very bottom, and then I use some Starbond glue to pour in there. Now we're going to be pouring epoxy in afterwards, but the Starbond just acts as a barrier to make sure that there's no epoxy leaks when we pour our epoxy. Now after that dries, and it does dry fast, we then take some hot glue and actually just make a nice perfect little dam around the knot holes. Now it's time for epoxy. I take some black opaque pigment with our Total Boat tabletop epoxy, mix up some epoxy first, and then mix in our black pigment. Now this specific epoxy is a 1-to-1 ratio, which makes mixing very easy, but I wouldn't suggest this on a larger, thicker pour. For these small ones, it works perfectly and it dries fairly quickly. Well, fairly for epoxy. Now the most important thing when working with epoxy is to make sure you're mixing thoroughly enough. Take your time and due diligence to ensure that you have a proper mix, and mix for at least a couple minutes. I then proceed to pouring a generous amount into the center of the knot hole, and then tap it down a bit, let it soak in, and then I blast it with a heat gun. Now the heat gun will just remove all those small bubbles that are coming to the surface, and you might have to pour a little bit more into each hole, but consistently for the most part, it's going to fill up quite quickly and easily.
Now as you can see, this board is quite flat thanks to those biscuits. The biscuits really hold this entire slab in place, and it made it much easier for us to put everything together, as well as the fact that we don't have to use my slab flattening mill with my router. We can just sand this thing flat and be done with it. Let's get to it.
Now because the epoxy is harder to sand down, I take my grinder with a 80 grit sanding disc and just grind away the surface quickly and easily. Just make sure you're wearing a respirator at this point because you do not want to be breathing in any of the stuff that is flying around. Now it's time for sanding, and this sander is definitely one of my favorite tools of all time, mainly because it has this turbo mode, which basically disengages the random orbital mode, and therefore it acts more as a grinder than a random orbital sander. I go over the entire topside surface with a 100 grit sandpaper on this turbo mode, and then I decide to flip it over and sand off the bottom smooth. Now the bottom I do grind off all those glue marks, as well as sand it down with the Bosch turbo mode, but I don't use the orbital mode for that side. Now the workstation needs to be 24 inches deep, however the slab is approximately 26 inches deep, and therefore I'm cutting it down and I'm actually going to be using that excess material as a larger front lip. Now this slab is 1 inch thick, and therefore you really don't need a front lip if you don't want one. However, I do want to cover up the railing system that's going to be there in place, and the railing itself is approximately 1 inch. So it should cover it up perfectly. And yes, I know this does look like a very hunky-dory track saw, and I will get a track saw one of these days, but I don't have one yet, so I just used some type of very straight material, braced it properly, then I just flipped that small piece over on top of itself, used some glue to glue up both sides, and then press them together. Now think of it as more of a hinge, like a piano hinge, and therefore you'll be able to mirror the pattern of the wood because you flipped it like a piano hinge, as you can see right there. Now after I let the glue dry for approximately 8 hours, I then take the clamps off and then proceed to cutting one of the edges. Now I'm only cutting one side and not both because I'm going to be cutting the exact dimension in place. I use a large carpenter square to ensure that I have a proper 90-degree angle that I can rest my fence up against on my circular saw.
Now it's time to fill up a few more holes that I didn't see. There's always a couple that probably need to be filled. And just remember with walnut, there are two very vast differences in shades, whether it's the lighter sapwood versus the actual rich dark brown wood. So if you are trying to fill a hole over here, make sure it's with the correlating color scheme. So I'm going to sand off a bit of this extra piece that I have lying around. I'll sand off this side to fill these holes, as well as I'll sand off this side to fill some more darker areas. So, note to self.
Now all you have to do once you have your sawdust is mix in a bit of wood glue and apply it to your holes. Now specifically with joint lines, I tape it off just because it's a lot easier to reduce the amount of sanding that you have to do afterwards, and therefore quick and easy cleanup. Now after our wood filler is fully dried, I then proceed to sanding, and now this is on our random orbital mode as you can see, and we are going from 100 grit to 150 to 200 grit sandpaper. At this point in time, I always suggest going with the grain, and as a general rule of thumb, I suggest going 1 inch for every second, therefore you can reduce swirl marks that way. Now because this is a workstation, we need some cord management, and therefore we're going to be drilling out some holes for grommet placements. As a general sanding tip, if you do want to make it easier on yourself to sand a smooth surface in the interior of a hole, well, just take a solid rod, take a strip of sandpaper, duct tape it to the rod, put it in your drill, and therefore, boom, an easy way to sand it smooth. Now once it's sanded smooth, I then take a 1/4 inch round over bit with my router and just round over the top and bottom edges. At this point in time, I then take my sander and start sanding away the front edge to make it perfectly flat and flush. Now you might have to switch it over to the turbo mode if it's not quite as smooth as you want it from the very get-go, but it's a fairly simple process, and once you have that complete, I then take the same round over bit that I just used and round over the top and bottom edge of the front lip. After that's complete, I then start sanding away again, but instead of showing you more sanding, how about let's say a big huge thank you to our sponsor this week, Mudwater. Now you might be asking yourself, what is mud water? Well, mud water is an alternative to coffee with 4 medical mushrooms and herbs with 1/7 the amount of caffeine that's in your normal cup of coffee, which means you get the energy without the angst, jitters, crashes of normal coffee. Each ingredient was added with a purpose, whether it's turmeric for inflammation, cinnamon to help process sugar cravings, cocoa and chai for mood and energy, lion's mane for focus, cordyceps for physical performance, and chaga and reishi for immune and stress, which I think we can all use a little bit right now. Now, I personally reached out to Mudwater, and the fact that they were so game and wanted to be a part of the BYOT family, I truly cherish and appreciate. So if you are so interested, please check out the link below because you can get 15% off by using the promo code BYOT. Now, getting back to the project, I just swapped off the entire surface with mineral spirits, which reduces the amount of dust and debris on the surface. However, after you let it dry a considerable amount, I then take a tack cloth to wipe off all of the remaining dust because the mineral spirits can only get so much. Now comes my favorite portion of a project, finishing. Now we are using General Finishes oil-based Armasil satin finish. Now this is a beautiful finish, especially for walnut because it has the beauty of an oil, but the strength and durability of a urethane. I find the best way to apply this finish is to just take a clean foam brush and wipe on a considerable amount as you go. This finish really showcases the beauty of walnut instantaneously, and it's also a good finish for epoxy with the knot holes. Now I go over the entire surface with one fluid coat, and then after I let it sit for about 5 minutes, I then come back and remove all the excess finish. Now that's very important, especially to do fairly quickly, because if you don't do it quick, then the surface and the finish becomes very tacky.
Woo-wee! As you can see, quite a beautiful slab this morning, and we let it dry overnight. Now I want to do at least 2 to 3 coats on this bad boy, but between coats I want to buff. Just try and take a little bit of the nibs off the top, and then use a tack cloth, wipe it down smooth, take all that stuff off, and then apply the finish.
Now this finish is very durable, but I would highly suggest applying 2 to 3 coats, especially if it's going to be a slab that has consistent wear and tear over time, or at least a lot of tension, which this slab will definitely have. Now if you haven't checked out the last BYOT, I would highly suggest doing so because you would be able to see how we got this entire home office from AuxBox in the backyard with a 130-ton crane. Now this is going to be a wall-to-wall workstation, which means a rail system is perfect in this type of application. Now for the supportive rail part of the equation, we could really use a number of different things. However, I decided to use this tube steel. Now this tube steel is perfect because it actually has slotted holes already built in, and therefore I'm able to use those holes for fastening locations vertically and horizontally. Now because this is wall paneling, it's very difficult to find a stud, so therefore I'm just using some very large hollow wall anchors for support. Now these suckers are very strong and have plenty of structural support, and I'll make sure and leave links in the description box below on where to actually purchase these if you're so interested. Now the nifty thing about these guys is the fact that you actually tighten them down first, then back them out, and then install your railing with the bolt you just pulled out. Just make sure you're checking for level at the same time you're doing this. Now I do the same thing on both sides, however on the back side I decided to put a larger, thicker steel L-metal plate in order to accommodate the large span that we have here. I wanted to ensure that we have plenty of support on the back side. Now this one did not come pre-drilled, however you're easily able to pre-drill your holes using a cobalt drill bit with some WD-40 just to give it a little bit of extra lubrication. So now that our support railing is in, it is now time for our wood slab. Now I measured the exact space that I need based upon where the railing was, which turned out to be 8 feet 8.5 inches exactly. Now while I'm ripping this cut on the other side, just make sure that you apply a bit of tape to that side before cutting. It basically makes the cut a little bit cleaner, especially if you don't want to do any sanding or finishing at this point. And at this point, one of the best feelings you can possibly have is the fact that it fit in perfectly the very first time. Now after we get all of our fasteners screwed and in place, we are done. And just like any good woodworking project, the attention is in the details, between the mirrored front edge lip to the grommets to the epoxy knot holes and everything in between. This project really did come together, and the fact that we have a very unique supportive rail system makes this tabletop feel like a true floating workstation. And of course, I had to give my own little BYOT love, right? This is a perfect way to close out this entire project, and one project that I can truly say is one beautiful, sexy beast. Oh yeah.
Keep on watching. Let's get started. Whoops.